Alright, let's talk about BG3 companions. This is a guide, a rating list, a tier list, all in one. I'm going to talk about the companions in Baldur's Gate 3 and how I feel they fit into a good aligned playthrough, if it's your first time, your second game, whatever. This doesn't take into account mechanics. For example, you can respec all of the companions to be whatever you want them to be, so it doesn't take into account like how good they perform in battle. But this does take into account their personality, how much they contribute to the overall experience, and generally how cool they have to have around. And I'm going to start at the very bottom of the tier list. For the companions that are not super great to have, but, you know, it's nice. They're nice to have around. So, D tier, I'd say. And for D tier, I'm going to put Halsin and Minthara here, just because they kind of go hand in hand, and you pretty much can't have one without the other unless you're modding or glitching or whatever. The point is, you really aren't supposed to have both of them together at the same time. One and the other have certain downsides. Overall, I think Minthara is a stronger character, especially if you are in a good allowed playthrough, but at the same time, you have to do some terrible things for getting Minthara. If you don't do those terrible things, you also let a lot of people die. So actually getting her is kind of questionable, but she is kind of interesting. At least more interesting than Halsin, who does come into play in Act 2 and has a pretty big role to play in how that turns out. But at the same time, he has very little to do after Act 2, and most of Act 3 is spent complaining about certain things that happen in Act 3. So overall, I'd say they're both together in D tier, and that they could use more content and contribute more to the overall experience. Now, C tier, I'd say Will and Minsk would go well here. Now, Will is a companion that I've had around in my active party quite a few times, and overall I like him a lot. Just his personality and the way that he's just a bro. He's there for you. He'll take a bullet for you, really, and he's just nice to have. But at the same time, his story isn't the most exciting. It does have certain things going for it, especially in Act 3, but at the same time, there's not too much character growth for Will, and he sort of stays the same throughout the entire time. I don't know what he's like if he sort of goes evil, but in terms of a good aligned playthrough, he's cool, but I wouldn't say that he's mandatory for a playthrough. Minsk, who's done really well in Baldur's Gate 3, is definitely fun to have, but he comes really late in the game. He comes into Act 3, and also like later in Act 3, you have to actually work to get him. So I would say overall he is an okay addition. Definitely funny, definitely fun to have around, and definitely a useful character. But in terms of like overall content, definitely C tier. I wouldn't go higher than that. And even then, that's pushing it a little bit. Now, if he was available earlier in the game, I would probably place him higher, at least higher than Will, but it is what it is for now. Next, we have the B tier. And in the B tier, I will place first Jaheira, because she is a returning character from Baldur's Gate 2, 1 and 2 actually, and she is overall a very cool character to have. She does have some story bits in Act 3 that are very important, and she is mandatory for recruiting Minsk, another character I just rated. Of course, the bad thing about Jaheira is that you get her really late. In fact, you get her at the start of Act 3. Overall, her content is, well, while sufficient, there isn't that much content to her for Act 3 in general. With that said, I do like her personality, her bits of wisdom, and generally her being an older party member, sort of wizened and more experienced than some of the others. It's kind of neat, and in general her personality is very cool. So, B tier. Next, Shadowheart. I know this may be controversial. Shadowheart is okay. Like, I like her development in the game, especially for a good aligned playthrough, but from what I understand, it actually is more interesting if she goes evil, and some of the outcomes of that are a little bit more heart-wrenching and generally better. For a good aligned playthrough, I would say Shadowheart is B tier, a little bit behind Jaheira, even though she has a ton of content in both Acts 1, 2, and 3, and Act 3 has a pretty cool conclusion to her story. Still, overall, I'd say that she's just not quite as strong as some of the higher-rated companions, just at least in terms of character growth, even though it's still significant. Again, this is all with a hefty but. And you can also maybe argue that Shadowheart beats out Jaheira, and Jaheira is lower ranked than her. I think it comes down to personal preference at that point. Would I recommend having Shadowheart for a full Good Online playthrough? Absolutely, you should definitely have her. Gale. He's a cool companion. I like Gale a lot. He has some cool scenes, some interesting things to say, some cool interactions. He knows a lot about magic and such. But unfortunately, like Shadowheart, I feel like that his character growth and development aren't quite as good as some of the characters above him in the tier list. And so I would place him right there with Shadowheart, somewhere in the same tier. Whether or not he's better than Jaheira is up to personal preference. A lot of people really like Gale, and like I said, I do like the character a lot. In fact, I like all the characters. But in terms of the overall narrative, I maybe wouldn't place him as high. One thing though, Gale does have a very significant part to play in Act 2, specifically the end of Act 2, and also Act 3, depending on the choices that you make. So whether or not you actually want to have them in your group, I definitely suggest having them in your camp, at least so that you can speak to him about his personal mission and his personal quest, because it does tie into the narrative in a fairly significant way. With that out of the way, let's move on to A tier. And in A tier, first and foremost, Astarion. Now, a lot of people think Astarion is kind of a weird, goofy character that you take along either to stake him or just to throw him into a pit. I say don't do that. Astarion is actually really cool. He has got a lot of entertaining things to say. His personality is very well developed. And he has a really, really cool conclusion in Act 3. I would definitely not miss it. He's just a really good character, and his character growth, if you're good aligned and if you spend the time, is absolutely worth it. Definitely take Astarion with you and definitely talk to him and sort of see how he plays out and what happens to him at the end. That's all I will say there. And I will move on to our penultimate companion, Karlach in A tier. So why Karlach? Karlach has a bittersweet story, and without really spoiling anything, her story doesn't have the most fairy tale of endings. Her struggle during the story is really what motivates a lot of her inner turmoil, and I think that is done very well. Just because of some of the content that happens with her and some of the content that doesn't happen with her, I will say that her development as a character is maybe a little bit behind Astarion, but at the same time, I think it's very cool. And overall, I really like her personality. She's very fun to have around. She has got a lot of cool interactions and generally funny things to say, and just an entertaining, cool person to have your back. Firmly in A tier, I believe, and in fact, Karlach was one of the characters I had with me the most, I think, during my Good Aligned playthrough, and I would definitely recommend having her around. And that leaves just one character for S tier, and if you know the Baldur Gate 3 companions, you know who this is going to be. And it's going to be Lae'zel. And before you ask, well, silly cat man with a bandana, you stupid goofy goober, you didn't even have Lae'zel during your playthroughs. Okay, I did have Lae'zel in a lot of my time playing the game, but of course she wasn't in my party most of the time. So why did I place her in S tier if she wasn't in my party? And that's because her story is very much tied into the very fabric of the overall story in Baldur's Gate 3. Her character growth is excellent. I think she has the most character growth and the most character development out of all of the companions. And she also has probably some of the coolest scenes in the game. Early on, actually, still in Act 1, some of the coolest scenes in the game and some of the coolest plot and lore dump that really opens up the narrative to what happens after Baldur's Gate 3 is over. I definitely recommend having her and going through her story parts. Do not skip Lae'zel, because she really adds a lot to the narrative, especially if you're good aligned and if you try to convince her of certain things during the story. Lae'zel's development really pays off. One last thing about companions. Like I mentioned in the video, I didn't have some of them in my group all that often, and that means my active party. Like I said, Lae'zel was not in my active party all that often, but I did rate her the highest out of all of the companions. For a good aligned playthrough, if you want the easiest possible time, I will say that probably a combination of Gale, Will, and Karlach and maybe Shadowheart is the easiest way to go through the game, where they pretty much agree with what you're doing and the choices that you make, and they don't disagree as much. If you want to have Astarion or Lae'zel, that's fine too, but do note that they will disagree with you occasionally, especially Astarion, and getting their approval up while being good may be a little difficult. I found Lae'zel to be fairly easy to max out if you do her special companion mission and whatnot, and sort of generally talk to her and agree with her. Astarion, on the other hand, requires a lot more careful decision making and cherry picking which decisions you make and which decisions you don't have them in your group for. If you want just to have fun and have some fun interactions, especially in Act 1, I highly recommend having Lae'zel and Shadowheart in the group, because they go back and forth, just arguing with each other and trying to one-up each other. It is fairly entertaining and definitely the highlight of Act 1 if you have both of those characters together. And that is everything. That is all the BG3 companions. With Phantom Liberty just around the corner, I am probably going to do a few videos on that, starting with the 2.0 update, previously known as 1.7, and then probably doing the actual Phantom Liberty content. If you have ideas about a video I could make regarding Baldur's Gate 3, or maybe some other game, let me know in the comments, and I will do my best. And with that, I will bid you adieu, and until next time. See ya.